Hi guys, it's Mrs. Murtaugh. Today I'm going to be reading Mr. Bumble by Kim Kennedy, illustrated by Doug Kennedy. Every spring the meadows became a buzzing and busy scene, with hundreds of bumblebees gathering pollen for their hive. Such work came easily to all the bees, to all that is, but one. His name was Mr. Bumble, and he was the clumsiest bee who ever buzzed. Sadly, when it came to gathering pollen, he could never take off from a flower without bumbling, fumbling, and tumbling. While the other bees buzzed back to their queen with mounds of golden dust, Mr. Bumble always returned with the smallest share. "Another empty bucket," Queen Bee would fuss. "Dense are all you seem to gather." One evening, the queen held court. "Something grand has happened," she announced. "Today, one of our scouts buzzed to an undiscovered clover patch. There you will find a gold mine of pollen." Everyone was excited about the news except Mr. Bumble. He couldn't help wondering what might lurk in that patch, just waiting to catch a clumsy bee. "Study this map well," declared the queen, "for tomorrow you journey there." "But what else did the scouts see?" Mr. Bumble asked. "Does something live in that patch? And if so, what if it's mean?" "Well," said the queen, "if that's true, those of you who are quick and clever have nothing to fear. But those who are not," she added, looking at Mr. Bumble, "beware." To Mr. Bumble, things looked grim indeed, for even if he made it to the patch, he could only guess what terrible things awaited him there. That night he dreamed of monsters doing dreadful deeds like plucking out his very wings. Though the next morning's journey was long and hard, Mr. Bumble finally managed to arrive, but only to find that the other bees had already filled their buckets and flown away. Teetering atop a blossom, Mr. Bumble began his lonely work. Plink went the pollen into his bucket. Clink went some more. But just when he was going plinkety-clink to the next flower, a frightful noise arose that sent a shiver around his stripes and curled his little toes. Mr. Bumble had to get out of there and get out of there quick, but he tripped and stumbled and landed with a horrible crash. "Oh no," he yelped in a helpless heap. "I'm done for," he cried in fear, for not only was he seeing stars, but the bucket was stuck on his head. Suddenly he was hoisted high in the air. "Please let me go," Mr. Bumble squeaked. Yet higher still he went. "Don't pluck out my very wings," he begged. "Why would we ever do that?" came a tiny voice as he was set gently upon the ground. Then the bucket was lifted away, revealing a splendid sight. "Fairies!" he buzzed with relief. Looking about, he realized how wrong he had been. Indeed, there wasn't one monster in the entire clover patch. As for the lift the fairies gave him, it was the best flight he'd ever had. "If I could fly like a fairy," he sighed, "I could gather pollen as well as the other bees." "We can teach you," the fairies chimed. "We'll show you how it's done." Mr. Bumble's first lesson was in taking off, so they launched him from a tiny blue bonnet. Beneath him, they stretched a spiderweb net to catch him if he fell. With a boing and a buzz, he sailed into the air, flying higher and straighter with each and every try. And when Mr. Bumble took off without trouble, the fairies knew it was time for his next lesson, how to land gently upon a flower. They guided Mr. Bumble by daisy chains so he wouldn't belly flop. He learned to step on flowers without disturbing a single raindrop. For the first time, he buzzed without bumbling, flew without fumbling, and twirled without tumbling. "I can finally fly with grace," he cried. "This calls for a celebration." So the fairies held a flyaway party for Mr. Bumble where he could give all their tricks a whirl, and never before had the sky been filled with such fancy feats of flight. Soon it was time for Mr. Bumble to go. He filled his bucket with pollen. "Thank you, my friends," he buzzed, as they all waved goodbye, and with his bucket held high, off he flew to his hive. Meanwhile, the queen was searching the evening sky. That clumsy Mr. Bumble must be lost again, she sighed. Just then she spotted a bee zipping through the air. Surely that can't be Mr. Bumble buzzing there. But who was it but Mr. Bumble who glided all the way to her throne? For Her Royal Highness, he said. And with a buzz and a bow, he presented his astonished queen with a bucket of golden dust. Hurrah! Cheered his fellow bees. Why, the queen cheered for him, too. What a fine bee you've turned out to be, she said. You deserve something better to carry. With that, she presented Mr. Bumble with a bucket made of gold. As for Mr. Bumble's old bucket, it was placed for future bees to see. Though old and worn, said Queen Bee, it is still an inspiring sight. Look on it as the humble beginning to every perfect flight. I hope you guys enjoyed that book. It was one of my kids' favorites.